recorded. So, and before we start, I would like to remind everybody that this event, like all events organized by the Center, are made possible thanks to some institutional support, including funding from the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in the US and the Office of the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Duke. And my special thanks today to Kelsey White for being here and helping me with the assistance, because it's quite late during the day. If you're online, please chat for the moment. Please turn off your video and sound. So Robert Barsky. Robert Barsky is an expert on Noam Chomsky, literary theory, confusion, refugees, immigration and refugee law, borders, and he has written a biography of Chomsky titled Noam Chomsky, A Life of Dissent, which was published in 1997 by MIT Press, followed in 2007 by The Chomsky Effect, A Radical Words Beyond the Ivory Tower. He's also the author of a novel, Hatched, from 2016, am I correct?
Yep.
So Robert Barsky works at the intersection of literature, humanities, law, with a focus on border crossings. He's a Canada Research Chair at Vanderbilt University, and he's a professor of humanities and jointly appointed faculty member in the law school at Vanderbilt. Today, he's going to talk about his newest book, Clamouring for Legal Protection, which has just been published by Bloomsbury Press. Yep. And written while he was a Rockefeller resident fellow in Bellagio. I really envy you.
Oh,
that must have been fantastic.
I might still be there, I'm not sure.
And in which, but I think you're going to tell us at length about it, you suggest that many stories in the Western traditions deemed to have enduring value offer insight into current discussion about the flight and plight of vulnerable migrants. Robert is also working on an edition of the Travaux Préparatoires to the 1967 Refugee Protocol, negotiated in 1965, a project funded in part by the Insight Grant Program, and a series of related articles on blog. You have also created, I think, a new journal online, Contour. Maybe you can tell us a bit about that, because Absolutely. I really think that's sure. with MIT.
That's right.
And it's the first time I met you, you talked to me about this project, so about the Contour one. So yes. Maybe if you can tell us a bit more about that.
I will absolutely do that.
Oh, okay, perfect. And he has written extensively on border crossing, on documentation, on narrative on law, including undocumented immigrants in an area of arbitrary law, so flight and plight of peoples deemed illegal, arguing and justifying, assessing the convention's refugee choice of moment, motive, and host country, on constructing a productive other, discourse theory on the convention refugee hearing. And is a founding editor of the international open access border journal, AmeriQuest. And please join me in welcoming today Robert Barsky to Duke. And I must say that you just gave a presentation at the law school yesterday at Duke.
Yep.
And then everybody showed up in presence.
Yep.
So I don't know what it says about the humanities people, but here
it's
everybody really is online.
So thank you, first of all. I've met you, but only on Zooms. So
yes, it's also the first time we're meeting in person.
So now I can see you on Zoom. This is a true hybrid experience. I can see you on Zoom.
It's true meta hybrid experience, but at least we have the opportunity to meet.
Cool.
And can I show the
Of course.
So that's the book. You can see it, Clamouring for Legal Protection, with a wonderful illustration of Alice in Wonderland.
Yes.
I found absolutely great.
How long would you like me to chat for? I could go on
45 minutes,
as long as
and then we can take questions.
45 minutes it is. Okay, I want to begin perhaps with a little bit of background so that we can situate this. But before I do, I wish to thank you so much for inviting me to Duke. And it's so amazing to be meeting in some way other than on Zoom, given our shared preoccupations with French and with French work. And if there are questions in French or Italian or some other language that I can learn in the next while, I'm happy to take them as you wish. So I want to perhaps situate this text because it comes out of a background of work that really began with language theory early on, that itself was just the product of a job that I had, part-time job in the summertime of 1987 when I was hired to work by a private company to do transcriptions of refugee hearings. And that may sound like a very secretarial job, really that's what it was, but it has an interesting philosophical or eventually an interesting discursive side to it, because as I reflected on it and as I listened to a lot of these stories, I realized that my work, my typing at that time, was going to stand in for the human beings who had suffered and who, on account of their suffering, had chosen to claim refugee status in Canada. So, the process at the time was strange. It's not been replicated since, but at the time, the government thought that it would be easier and faster to do refugee adjudication claims if they were written down rather than orally presented. So that means that I was the intermediary through whom people were turned into paper, if you wish. People were turned into their stories. And the refugee is a very dramatic example of this, because if you are being turned into your story, if for example, I was being turned into my story as Professor Angel has just done now, then you can still look back at work that I've done, or maybe look me up or something like that, and situate the introduction as regards actual work that I've done, or maybe records that are online. At the time, refugees who were coming into Canada had no such luck. They generally speaking had no dossiers at all. And it was a period when, for example, people would consume their passports while traveling to ensure that the fact that it was a false passport purchased by an intermediary would not be discovered. They were very afraid that if they were found to have committed a crime in order to enter the country, that it would have negative consequences on their eventual asylum hearing. So my point is that they arrive with nothing, literally. They arrive with no past. And then they sit, as I'm sitting right now before this screen, and they constructed themselves as refugees. This was my entrance point into the world of refugee law. And as I said, if you're interested in literature, it's an interesting process, because that's exactly what an author does. An author creates characters, generally from nothing or very little, and those characters eventually take on flesh. The challenge in a refugee hearing is that you're looking for a yes. That is, you're looking for the asylum to be claim to be accepted. So if the body, as it were, that's created in language is unsuccessful, then the consequences are not just, it's not a credible person or whatever else. The consequences could be that the person is sent back and persecuted or killed. So it's a very unique experience to consider this transformation of the body into language in a refugee setting. When I worked on this, I landed up getting involved in an act of social justice in which I wanted to diffuse broadly to the Canadian public the nature of the refugee process and the lies that were being told to Canadians about whether or not they should be admitted as refugees. There were many falsehoods said on publicly about whether or not the refugees who were coming to Canada deserved status. And I had a very unique perspective because I heard hundreds and eventually thousands of these claims. So I really knew a lot about how they justified their claims, the evidence that they brought to bear, and so forth and so on. As a consequence of this work, which was supposed to just be a summertime job, I wrote my dissertation and first book about this process of what I've called constructing a productive other, turning the self into an asylum claimant. And then rather than it being a catastrophic decision to have told Canadians what had happened, in my case, it led to my first major research job, which lasted about 7 years, in which I worked for various institutions associated with the National Institute for Scientific Research on immigration and border matters. So this has been an obsession for a long time. Eventually, I was hired in a language and literatures department, but kept my focus and kept my interest in migration and law. So it's an unusual path, perhaps. but it helps explain my fascination with language, but also my fascination with storytelling as a way to enter into a space. This book that I will talk about briefly is filled with the classics, which itself is a problematic area. As you know, to think about the canon and the exclusionary quality that the canon has intrinsically is an important question to ask. But this book grows out of not a desire to valorize the canon for its own sake, but rather it grows out of insight that I acquired during my last book, Undocumented Immigrants in an Era of Arbitrary Law, in which I learned that no matter how vociferously against refugees or immigrants somebody is, generally speaking, and this here I can even include Donald Trump, generally speaking, there are a few exceptions. That people, even who are as xenophobic as you can possibly imagine, know somebody who they think is an exception. And that somebody is usually a cleaner or a babysitter or somebody that they've come to know well. So the insight that arose out of the many interviews that I did leading up to that book was that we're better off arguing on behalf of somebody that we know than arguing on behalf of a general concept. It's very difficult to say, we're all immigrants and therefore we should accept all immigrants. That argument rarely works very well. So what happens if we take people who we know well from literature instead of people that we know because they clean our car or paint our house or do our gardens? That was the kind of impetus behind this, to consider that Alice or Dracula or Dante or Ulysses are all characters that we've come to know, almost like we know people in our own lives. So in other words, this text is a book of refugee law. By the time you come to the end of this book, you really know what you need to know, the nuts and bolts of refugee law. I developed this book while teaching at the Vanderbilt Law School, but all of the examples are from texts that we know and love. So I promised today that I would really invoke those texts, and I'd be happy to talk about what we can learn from them. But my emphasis in this discussion will be the texts themselves, because they're so powerful and they're so beautiful and they're so fun. So in short, I've been interested over the years in the question of how to shift people's attitudes about border crossing and the migration of vulnerable persons. As part of the research for this book, I reached out to leading practitioners in the field and asked for insights about their own path towards the assistance of vulnerable migrants. And a number of people gave me some extremely interesting answers. So for example, Thomas Gemeltoft Hansen, who's the research director at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights, wrote to me that he chose to work in this particular domain because he was inspired by the plea of the Trojan refugee Aeneas to Queen Dido when he washed ashore in present-day Libya. So this is from that text. What men, what monsters, what inhuman race, what laws, what barbarous customs of the place shut up a desert shore to drowning men and drive us to the cruel seas again. Of these lines, Gemeltoft Hansen commented to me, quote, "This part of Virgil's Aeneid zooms in on the basic norms governing the encounter between the powerful and the dispossessed. An encounter that, if with a somewhat reversal of caste, is played out thousands and thousands of times these years as refugees and migrants try to cross the very same waters." So these exact concomitant example. I also asked this same question of a Brazilian composer named Jonatas Manzoli, who resided with me in the Rockefeller Foundation's Villa Serbelloni in Bellagio. So as you mentioned, I wrote the first draft, the first sort of skeleton of this book as a Rockefeller resident. It's a unique experience because you're with 16 other people, none of whom are in your field. And you're forced and obligated, and this type of obligation I'm willing to buy into, to have at least one cocktail hour per day for the period that you're there. And you have to have dinner there as well. And the idea is that you meet with people from all sorts of disciplines and you talk about your work, and we would present it in the weeks that we were there. So Manzoli was there creating an opera about the Syrian refugee crisis based on his reading of a book called Macunaíma, a canonical 1928 novel by Mario de Andrade. In conversation, this is what Manzoli said: "I found inspiration in this text, not only because of the many possible analogies with refugees and social justice and human rights, but rather it's quite universal to see how many times human beings who are looking for better ways of life are suffocated by national identities. I feel that Macunaíma is not just a great Brazilian modernist work, it's also a way of showing how we are made up of many cultural layers. To negate these cultural textures is to suffocate the major identity that is inside ourselves, the human identity," he writes. In fact, it turned out that virtually everyone that I had asked about their commitment to social justice could name some literary text that inspired them. Julius Gray, for example, Canada's leading civil rights lawyer, mentioned Virgil's writing. Noam Chomsky wrote to me that it was his early engagement with George Orwell. Katie Redford, the founder of Earth Rights and another Bellagio resident when I was there, invoked John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. And Robin Gorna, another person with whom I was living in the villa, reflected on her own readings of Virginia Woolf, in particular, A Room of One's Own. And Thomas Spijkerboer, the founding director of the migration unit at the Free University of Amsterdam, recalled an array of Dutch classics which he read outside of his curriculum in school. We can also look at writers themselves, the writers of the so-called classics, who often had seminal experiences or texts that led them to orient their work in the direction of social justice. The 19th century writers, for example, Fanny Fern, Charles Dickens, Voltairine de Cleyre, Émile Zola, Francis Harper, and Frederick Douglass, for example, all speak of formative events and then go on to write texts that become formative for their own readers. Even William Shakespeare, in the only text that we have written in his own hand, expressed a sense of moral outrage about the treatment of displaced persons. Shakespeare did so in his contributions to a play called The Book of Sir Thomas More by Anthony Munday, which Shakespeare was asked to improve. That play was based on real events, which it then dramatizes. Between 1330 and 1550, 64,000 foreigners came to England in search of better lives. This created tension, particularly amongst those who believed that these newcomers might take away their jobs. These tensions boiled over in London when on the 1st of May, riots broke out. Thomas More, the then deputy sheriff of London, tried to calm the crowd down with a speech that Shakespeare imagines as follows. So Shakespeare writes this part of the story, but based on true events. So this is Shakespeare. "You'll put down strangers, kill them, cut their throats, possess their houses, and lead the majesty of law in Liam to slip him like a hound. Alas, alas, say now the king, as he is clement if the offender mourn. Should so much come too short of your great trespass as to banish you, where would you go? What country, by the nature of your error, should give you harbor? Go you to France or Flanders, to any German province, to Spain or Portugal, nay, anywhere that not adheres to England? Why, you must needs be strangers. Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper that breaking out in hideous violence would not afford you an abode on this earth? Whet their detested knives against your throats, spurn you like dogs, and like as if that God owned not, nor made not you, nor that the elements were not all appropriate to their comforts, but chartered unto them? What would you think to be thus used? This is the stranger's case. And this, your mountainous inhumanity. These kinds of reflections by these authors and these social justice activists have inspired me to explore the overlapping spaces between international refugee law, literature, and border crossing by asking an array of questions. What can an approach to the great books that focuses upon border crossing teach us about immigration and refugee law? What purpose does it serve to read canonical works from the perspective of migration? And why is it interesting, even for general readers, to approach works such as the Bible, the Divine Comedy, Paradise Lost, Frankenstein, The Last Man, Alice in Wonderland, Toni Morrison's Paradise, or Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, imagining that major characters described therein endure similar challenges and face similar obstacles as contemporary refugees? My proposal in this book is that through the lens of migration and border crossing, many, if not most, of the so-called classics from the great tradition of books and many of the most memorable characters therein can provide us with precious insights into the challenges of displacement and the quest for protection against persecution. Indeed, whatever one thinks about the canon of classical work, it may turn out to be enriching to reaccustom ourselves with the challenges that are faced by characters who are familiar to us. Characters such as Ulysses, Odysseus, Moses, Dante, Satan, Frankenstein's monster, or Dracula, as a means of better understanding the plight of forced migrants. And so I've selected scenes from canonical plays, poems, and novels that make specific reference to characters who are fleeing some kind of untenable situation in search of a better state, or perhaps a better state of mind. One of the joys of working on a book like this one, which spans so many areas and eras and such a wide array of texts, is that it allows one to see some really surprising concordances. Dante's Divine Comedy, for example, opens with Dante himself lost in the woods and in the midst of a spiritual crisis. What follows is akin to a dream sequence in which he sees wolves and lions and then espies the shape of a man. His reaction is one of terror. And as I downward rushed to reach the plain, before mine eyes appeared there one aghast and dumb like those that silence long maintain. When I beheld him in the desert vast, whate'er thou art, or ghost, or man, I cried, I pray thee show such pity as thou hast. In response, the figure before him, who turns out to be Virgil, provides him with some details of his life, which inspires Dante to guess his identity. And thou, in sooth, art Virgil, and the fount whence in a stream so full doth language flow. He is indeed Virgil. And so for his redemption, Dante follows him all the way to heaven and, as you all know, to his great love, Beatrice. Similar encounters are found in the Bible, when God appears before an uncertain Moses, creating the rather amazing scene in which the creator of all things is charged with convincing one of his own creations that he says that he is who he says he is. Moses fears that he won't be taken seriously by those to whom he's being asked to assist, in part because of his weak oratorical skills and his speech impediment. Even more interestingly, Moses is uncertain as to the nature of the person who's asking him to act as a kind of modern day smuggler, charged with assisting the people of Israel to flee. Is he who he claims to be? And more importantly, will Moses be able to convince those who are being persecuted that he means good? In a surprisingly related encounter, the ghost of Scrooge's own partner in the counting house, Marley, appears before a cynical unbeliever, Ebenezer Scrooge, in Charles Dickens' Christmas classic, A Christmas Carol. Scrooge is skeptical and reticent when he meets his former partner, just as Moses was reticent when he meets God. But in the case of Scrooge, he's not just doubting, he's actually rude. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" I'll do my ghost voice. "Much." With a mask, it's just so fun, man. Do you know? Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life, I was your partner, Joseph Marley." Marley senses Scrooge's uncertainty. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" asks Marley. "Because," said Scrooge, and this might be the most remarkable words ever written in the English language. So get ready. Scrooge says, "You might be an undigested bit of beef." I think that's just spectacular. "A blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an undercooked potato." I think from a language perspective and from a refugee law perspective, all of what Scrooge says here reminds us of the challenges that forced migrants face as they desperately seek assistance in the often perilous trek from home to host country. In the absence of proper assistance for those in flight, how can we expect that refugees are going to make the right decisions? You know, you might think that this is God, but it turns out to not be God, just as Scrooge might think that it was Marley and it turns out to be somebody else. Other texts from the great tradition reveal similarly crucial insights into the fight for protection against persecution, including the often painful reality that the new world is likely to offer not offer the kind of protection that vulnerable people seek. For people described, for example, in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, California will never be the Mecca that inspired them to leave Oklahoma. Quote, "Maybe we can start again in the new rich land in California where the fruit grows. We'll start over." But you can't start. Only a baby can start. You and me, why, that's all that's been. The anger of a moment, the thousand pictures, that's us. This land, this red land, that's us. And the flood years, and the dust years, and the drought years, that's us. We can't start again. The bitterness we sold to the junk man, he got it right, but we have it still. And when the owner men told us to go, that's us. And when the tractor hit the house, that's us until we're dead. To California or any place, everyone a drum major leading a parade of hurts, marching with our bitterness. And someday the armies of bitterness will all be going in the same direction. And they'll all walk together and there'll be a dead terror from it. So that's Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. In short, the paradise that a refugee might seek may itself be a place of newfound torment, of continued bitterness, or of endless struggle. The so-called Okies are hoping to start again, but such a dream of starting over is an illusion, and this we see in refugee law all the time. In the realm of forced migration, the ultimate example, I think, of this quest for a new beginning is found in Milton's Paradise Lost. Milton's Paradise Lost might be in itself the greatest text for an understanding of refugee law. As you recall from reading it, in that text, 1/3 of all the angels of heaven rise up against God's rule. 1/3 of God's angels, including God's closest ally, Satan. They rise up, and as a consequence of having lost the civil war against God, he banishes them forever, very uncompromising, forever to hell. So what are they supposed to do? Can they really start over in this God-forsaken place? And remember some of the details of hell. if you haven't read Milton's Paradise Lost for a while, it's dark, but there's illumination enough to illuminate your suffering. And the illumination itself is the source of great heat, intense heat. So it's an unimaginably horrible place in every possible way. And Satan convenes, unlike God, interestingly enough, Satan convenes a meeting to try to discuss how to make things better. So that is what he argued God didn't do in heaven. He's going to do it in hell. So he goes to a place that he invents, a word that's still with us today called pandemonium, pan, demon, yum, all of the demons together. And they have a meeting. And the meeting is, how can we live in this place? Like, okay, so it's horrible. We've moved from Paris to northern Quebec. Maybe not. Maybe northern Quebec is not that bad. But you know, and you have to try to figure out how you're going to live. A number of different demons give answers, and Moloch is the answer that I think all public policy people who are involved in immigration matters should worry. Moloch is so angry at God. Moloch sees that there's no way back to his homeland, that is to say heaven. So Moloch wants one thing. Moloch wants revenge. My sentence is for open war. Of wiles more unexpert, I boast not. Let them who contrive, who need, or when they need, not now. For while they sit contriving, shall the rest, millions that stand in arms and longing wait the signal to send, sit lingering here, heaven's fugitives, and for their dwelling place accept this dark, opprobrious den of shame. The prison of his tyranny who reigns by our delay, no. Let us rather choose, armed with the hell flames and fury all at once, or heaven's high towers, to force resistless way, turning our tortures into horrid arms against the torturer. When to meet the noise of his almighty engine, he shall hear infernal thunder, and for lightning see black fire, and horror shot with equal rage among his angels. And his throne itself, mixed with Tartarian sulfur and strange fire, his own invented torments. That's the nightmare, I think, that policymakers can imagine when they are acting out against foreigners. This passage, I think, contains very real policy implications pertaining to the creation of a sense of belonging amongst new migrants. This is a very powerful force, worth considering for those, and I know you can't imagine this, who might consider branding foreign nations shithole countries, or foreigners from Latin America as rapists and murderers, something that we've heard, alas, from the leader. The real monster in this story, as it turns out, is amongst us. Indeed, the classics contain many morality tales appropriate for moments of populist xenophobia and racism. And there's no better example here than Bram Stoker's Dracula. Dracula, I always think of this as a little bit like a Canadian. Dracula looks like us, kind of acts like us, has a lot of similarities, but there's slight differences. And that's exactly what we have here when Jonathan first meets Dracula. He meets him for the first time in his castle. He looks like a pretty respectable aristocratic gentleman at first, but something slightly off. So here's Jonathan's notes. Well, you know, he was tall, he was pretty pale. Oh, and there were hairs on his palms. The nails were long and fine and cut to a sharp point. As the Count leaned over me and his hands touched me, I could not but repress a shudder. It may have been that his breath was rank, but a horrible feeling of nausea came over me, which do what I would, I could not conceal. The Count, evidently noticing it, drew back, and with a grim sort of smile, which showed more than he had yet done, his protuberant teeth, sat himself down on his own side of the fireplace. So on this basis, Dracula reveals himself to be foreign, truly foreign, and in fact, a risk or a deemed risk to the domestic population. And some experts decide that they need to address this problem of vampires, particularly multiplying vampires. So one of the experts, as you remember from the story Dracula, is a doctor named Van Helsing. And Van Helsing sits people down and explains to them how dangerous these vampires are, despite what we might think. So rather than exhibit empathy or kindness or openness or whatever else towards the vampires, the doctor says, you better be careful. He says, quote, "How then are we to begin our strike to destroy them? How shall we find his where? And having found it, how can we destroy it? My friends, this is much. It is a terrible task that we must undertake, and there may be consequences to make the brave shudder. For if we fail in our fight, he must win. And where will we end? Life is nothing. I heed him not. But if we fail, it's not just life or death. It's that we will become as Dracula. That we henceforth will become foul things of the night, just like him, without heart, without conscience, preying on the bodies and souls of those who we love best. To us forever will the gates of heaven be shut, for who shall open them to us again? We go on for all time abhorred by all, a blot on the face of God's sunshine, an arrow in the side of him who died for man. But we are face to face with a duty, and in such case, can we shrink? For me, I say no. So this is it. You've got to go after these vampires. You've got to kill them. You've got to track them down, keep them out. And if you find one, stab it in the heart with a stake, cut its head off, and stuff it with garlic. This is pretty brutal, right? Dracula's strength, his shifty character, and his non-Christianity, note that, are all potential menaces to our God-fearing Christian society. This might sound familiar. Let me quote from a tweet, from a web page. Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the US until our country's representatives can figure out what's going on. According to Pew Research, among others, there is great hatred towards us Americans by large segments of the Muslim population. Most recently, a poll from the Center for Security Policy released data showing that 51% of those polled agreed that Muslims in America should have the choice of being governed by Sharia. Sharia authorizes such atrocities as murder against non-believers who won't convert, beheadings, and other unthinkable acts that pose great harms to Americans, especially women. Mr. Trump stated, without looking at the various polling data, it's obvious to anybody the hatred is beyond comprehension. Where this hatred comes from and why we'll have to determine. Until we're able to determine and understand this problem and the threat it poses, our country cannot be the victims of the horrendous attacks by people who only believe in jihad and have no sense of reason or respect for human life. If I win, I'm going to make America great again. The concordances in the language, and there are many examples between the website and Dracula, are shocking. These are lugubrious examples to provide helpful insights into the challenges I think that are facing forced migrants. But I don't want to leave you on a wonderful evening after a warm Durham day with such lugubrious thoughts. So I want to end with my favorite migrant, my dear friend Alice. Alice is, as you know, hardly a forced migrant, but rather she crosses the border. She goes down the rabbit hole for a reason that I hope all of us will at some point decide to travel, which is that she's bored. She's sitting on a warm summer day with her sister, thinking of pleasurable ways to fill her time. But, quote, Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeped into the book that her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it. And she thought, what use is a book if it has no pictures or conversations? So, of course, I want to quickly note that I put pictures in my book because Alice told me to. Alice is not interested in her sister's book, and as it turns out, she's sleepy. So she weighs her options. She was considering in her own mind, as well as she could, for the hot day made her very sleepy and very stupid, whether the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be able of getting up and picking the daisies when suddenly a rabbit with pink eyes ran close to her. And luckily, the rabbit spoke English. There was nothing so remarkable about that, nor did Alice think it very much out of the way to hear Rabbit say to itself, oh dear, I shall be late. When she thought it over afterwards, it occurred to her that she ought to have wondered at this. But at the time, it all seemed quite natural. But when the rabbit actually took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket and looked at it and then hurried on, Alice started to her feet, for it flashed across her mind that she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat pocket or a watch to take out of it. And burning with curiosity, she ran across the field after it. And fortunately, she was just in time to see it pop down a large rabbit hole under the hedge. That's why she leaves. That's why she crosses the border. That's why she goes down the rabbit hole. And I think that that might be the real lesson here in some ways, which is that ought to be the motivating factor that inspires us to do the very natural act of crossing borders. That rather than demand, and I explained the nuts and bolts of this in here, rather than demand of, say, asylum seekers that they somehow justify through evidence of their pain and suffering their decision to cross a border, that somehow they have to prostrate themselves before us to say, look at this, look at the scars, look at the suffering, allow me to recall the pain. That's the only way that they can justify their existence in a host country where they'll be safe. In some level, that's preposterous. In some level, it's preposterous that we demand that of people who are fleeing persecution, but let's go even further. It is the case that a small class of privileged people, of whom I think I can include myself, experience the world more or less as a world of open borders. You own a passport, you have a credit card, you don't have a record, you get on a flight and you fly almost anywhere. We have this thing that lots of people like to invoke, the bucket list. So the bucket list is, it's your dreams. It's you being Alice and bored and not willing to make another daisy chain. So instead, you decide that you wish to explore, as one does. So it's okay for those people, but for other people who, by the way, need to flee or need to find work or seek adventure. Somehow the world needs to be closed for those people. Adventure, exoticism, curiosity, somehow that's not good enough for the poor, for the downtrodden, for the persecuted. I think that hypocrisy is unbearable. And therefore, I'm an advocate of virtually open borders. Why not? So that's something I can throw out as a kind of provocation. And then quickly to say that this book comes out of a belief, after having worked on this stuff for 35 years, that there are very powerful limits to policy and political approaches to this realm. And you see it every election. You can say until you're blue in the face that we're all immigrants. You can say that you're blue in the face that we've welcomed people in the past and we should therefore welcome them in the future and so forth. But this does not seem to be enough. So there is a power, and I'll invoke this website. There's perhaps a power that's unique to art, which is that rather than counting the numbers, rather than looking at the big data, rather than searching for the obscure or non-obscure laws that would justify us opening up borders, we can be made to feel with Odysseus, feel with Dante, feel with Alice in Wonderland in ways that may be more powerful. So this journal that you asked about is an effort to do this very thing. I've teamed up with MIT's Media Lab, and we've created a new site, a new realm, a new way to use digital spaces to represent artists who are doing work in border crossings. And we've just finished our first project. So this is called Contours Collaborations through MIT. and Vanderbilt. It's our first collaboration with sculpturists. And what we've been able to do is represent the sculptures in ways that are unprecedented, because we have a group of coders who can create textures and so forth on the screen that have not been done. So it's very exciting. And because also this is a realm of refugee law, I hired refugees to do the filmography. So actual themselves claimants who worked on this entire project, who I paid, and then also commissioned original scores of music to accompany the site. Also people who I commissioned and paid, so as to create this very immersive experience. This is the first of what I hope will be many efforts in this regard. And it's a long-standing collaboration that I'm able to fund through my former Canada Research Chair and through ongoing funding that we are now soliciting and have with a series of artists. So and what's kind of cool about this particular project is the challenge that we've been offered by MIT is we will build it, but only if it's new. And I kind of sat there and thought, I don't know what that means. I don't know what new in the internet is. I don't have enough knowledge of what's possible and not possible. So what we're doing instead is we're commissioning artists, and we're sitting the artists down and saying, okay, dream. What do you want? How do you want to represent your work that you can't do today? We'll have coders, and we'll if it's creatable, we'll create it. So that's the journal.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Robert. There are people in the room that are on the air that you cannot always see, but I would like to open the floor for question. Of course, I have many, but I think just to read all these very striking passages you've selected as examples of the various situations and perils that people fleeing from persecutions encounter, and the, of course, hairy and not distracting echoes between Dracula and Donald Trump's discourse.
Yes, sorry about that.
No, not sorry. I think that was very illuminating of what we've been through for the past 5 years, and we hope that it's not going to happen again, even though we can't be sure of that. Okay, but I would think, yeah. So I would just like first to open the floor to questions, and because there are not that many of you left online, I think you can really, switch on your camera and audio, and maybe ask your question directly to Robert, so that he could maybe see you on the screen. We are facing a screen, so in the room. So if you have questions you would like to ask directly to him. Okay, seems that everybody is either shy. We have a question from Julia. Julia, you can unmute yourself.
Hi.
Hi, Julia.
Hi, how are you? This was a wonderful talk, and I was wondering, through your time in transcribing the stories of migrants, what did you find was an important part of their story to include, and how did you frame their stories in order to help them receive asylum?
Wow. So those are unbelievably gigantic questions with incredible implications. I'm going to tell you a bunch of things that you may not have imagined would be part of this. One of them is that this was an effort on the part of the Canadian government to privatize the act of transcribing these works. It had never been done before in a private setting. And as a consequence, the private companies who were doing it were paid by the page to do the transcriptions. So let's pretend I'm the person who's suffered. So I'd say, I went through hell. I was tied down to a bed, and electrical current was appended to my genitals, and I felt great pain and suffering and passed out. Okay, let's say what the person says. But that's not the way it sounds. The way it sounds in the hearing is, bon, alors, vous voyez, j'étais attaché à un lit, et mais je peux pas vous dire, mais c'était horrible, and so forth and so on, right? And then that would have to be translated into English. So I heard ga, and I heard twee, and I heard French, and I heard Spanish, all these different languages. So in other words, the narrative is constantly broken up by the interpreter. And since the transcriber is paid by page, there was a lot of incentive to break the narrative up into component parts. Because if you could turn it into a lot of pauses and hesitations and so forth, you get paid more. That sounds like a bizarre thing to say to you, but it's not, because it's very difficult to read a text that's broken up like that. And in particular, it's very difficult because the reality of a hearing is that 75% is usually tears. So their decision to do it not in person was mind-bending to me, because you lose the real testimony. And torture is made to disorient you. So, and whereas in the Western world, we want facts. How many times were you raped? By whom? How long did it last? How many days? How long were you in there? Well, if you have suffered the ignominy of torture in this fashion, how many times, how many days? I mean, those are preposterous questions. In the same way that if you were beaten by somebody with a glove and you can't remember the color of the glove, and I'm giving you, I regret to say I'm giving you real examples, it sounds like you're lying. Oh, you don't know if the glove is blue or brown or black? You must be lying. You must be making this up. I would think the contrary. Usually, if you can't remember, or if the story is disjointed and whatever else, that's exactly what happens in torture. So that's a huge part of all this. And it led me to the revelation that the more disjointed, the more filled with bizarre contradictions and so forth and so on. At some level, you could argue, the more likely it is to be a true story. But I also realized that there's no way in hell I could put myself in the situation of telling you which of those two stories is true. That this dream that we have of somehow being able to adjudicate these claims is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And people live these things very differently. You'd have, I moved to the example of Rwanda. A lot of my friends from Rwanda have one thing in common, which is that they all watch their family be murdered. All of them. It's one thing that the 100 people I know well from Rwanda have endured, is the murder of their own family. The range of emotion from those 100 people go from people who are totally unable to function because of that, to people who are the most gregarious, funny, happy-go-lucky, brilliant people I've ever known. And it's the same experience at the same time of people more or less the same age. So these are some of the revelations that one garners, particularly if you hear a lot of these stories. So now when I hear, for example, well, there's a way to make this better, we can improve the hearing so that people, so that we can, scientifically analyze the truth of their narrative, it's nonsense. It's also nonsense because people are also told en route to the host country about what to say in a hearing. And if somebody saves your life, if somebody rescues you, and their last words to you are, don't say whatever, don't mention me, you're likely to follow what they say. And then when the officer says, you lied to us, you never told us that you were helped across that desert by this person, so we're going to reject you, which they do all the time. That's nonsense. So those are some of the things that you hear that I think you learn from the transcription process. And this process, which is very familiar to us, when you are trying to convince somebody of something, you're likely to say what you think the person wants to hear. But in a refugee setting, which is, again, it has unique qualities, you have been, in many cases, beaten within an inch of your life by somebody wearing a uniform. And now somebody wearing a uniform is saying, you can trust me. Tell me everything. Go ahead, I'm ready. That you don't want to tell them everything, or that you want to create another story, or that you don't want to relive the trauma, or that you can't relive the trauma, that's all perfectly natural. So I think we're putting people through not just re-trauma events, but also impossible events that can't really tell us very much at all. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's some of the many horrifying lessons I learned along the way.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And I was wondering if there were other questions. Because, I mean, I know very few people who are working like you do at the crossings of law and literature in regards to refugee. And I find it, extremely strong, I mean, as a and enriching as a position, because very few people can do that. Often when we people in the humanities are talking about refugees or border crossing, we're talking about representations that we know how to analyze, we know to interpret, and we know how to empathize with. But I think that's very different than being in a hearing, being at a court. And so I was curious about, because this event is organized by the Center of French and Francophone Studies. So people who are attending, I know some of them, they are really trained in the humanities, but were the questions and the reaction different? And was your talk different when you gave it at the law school yesterday? What particular angle did you have, and how, because yeah, I'm sure that's a distinctive audience.
Yeah,
it's a different audience.
The book ends with a plea, actually, for law schools. Law schools are, a lot of my students go into law because Marcia and I take them on an amazing semester. They get to see international law and refugee studies, whatever else. And a lot of them, take classes with me and then land up applying. And over I've had, 25 or 30 years of having collaborations of different sorts in law schools. And one of the things that happens in law schools is that you are almost told, you are now in the law school, forget everything you knew. You're not celebrating your background in African American studies. You're not celebrating your Romance languages and so forth and so on. You are there to do law. And I can tell you that as a professor, I'm now a faculty member in the law school at Vanderbilt. The first months or even years of doing that are extraordinarily intimidating, because unlike the humanities, in which we are very, very open to discussion, we want to have a legal example and so forth and so on, a law school can be very parochial. And they can very much insist and say, well, free speech, we're not talking about Voltaire, we're talking about the decision of the Supreme Court, and Voltaire is not an issue here. We're not going to, that's for them historians to do. And I hate to say it, but that is a feeling that one gets in the law school, that they're doing the very serious stuff. I'll give you an example that blew my mind. I went to a talk at the law school in which it was argued that this horrible thing that I absolutely hate, which is being forced to, I love it for public health reasons, but it's very difficult to do our profession when we're masked. So this person said, we should now that we're seeing the effects of masks in the courtroom, we should make it such that all hearings are always done with masks forever. And the reason is because then we can scientifically weigh the truth of what's being said without that, kind of horrible thing called emotion. And I can tell you that most refugees' hearings sound a lot like First of all, imagine transcribing that. And second of all, listen to what that does to you as you hear it. That's what it is. That's what a refugee hearing sounds like. You're going to put on a mask and pretend that emotions don't matter, tears don't matter. You got to hide them in favor of linguistic matter. It's nonsense, absolute nonsense. So the law humanities thing is, and the great schools, and I include here Duke, and I include Vanderbilt, and so forth and so on. A lot of them have literature and law courses. A lot of the humanities entertain legal examples. But as a scholar, you got to be careful. And this is the hard part. And this is why this is by far the hardest thing I've ever worked on. You also can't make mistakes from one to the other. And that's the challenge. You can't go into a law setting and not know the law well. So literature and law demands, first of all, that you know what you're talking about in terms of the literature, which is a text like this is terrifying. Right? I mean, I'm only talking about the most well-known texts in the universe. But on top of that, then there's the legal stuff, and you don't want to get discredited. So the amount of effort, if you love scholarship, it's a tremendous realm. The amount of effort to make sure that you do know the legal precedents and so forth and so on, that's a lot of work. But as you say, it's the field work often that makes the big difference. It's going to the courts, sitting with the translators, hanging out with the public defenders. Then you get. That's why I think law students love for example, clerking so much. It's such a great thing. So yeah, so what was it like yesterday? I think a lot of the law students are terrified of losing their humanities. You're not terrified of losing your humanity, you're terrified of losing your humanities. And a lot of them want to, even if they go into big law, continue to do public health work or public service, or maybe continue to read novels, God forbid. So that's quite seductive. Here, of course, the setting is very different. Here you're saying, wow, what a cool corpus. I've never heard of that. I think I'm going to take a look at, for example, for questions like you said, representation and so forth and so on.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. I have one question, which is about the journal, and also because we have another event on Friday with Fabienne Brugère and Guillaume Leblanc on an exhibition they have creating following their book, La fin de l'hospitalité,
Well,
the end of hospitality, which, you know, they went to Calais, they went to Lampedusa, they went to the Greek islands during the 2015 migrant crisis, and they come up with, I think, a similar, not completely similar, but a kind of an approach that has some affinities with yours. They've realized that curating an exhibition, going through the arts and the aesthetics was a way to enable concepts to gain more strength. And working on the concept of hospitality and all the tensions and the paradoxes that this concept in itself and cases, as we know since Derrida, and even more, but even before, through contemporary artworks was the best way to, you know, to have an impact even publicly, and to even have an approach to those vulnerable situations or situations of persecution, and questioning also our own ethical responsibilities toward those people. So I think, you know, it's the fact that you have this journal that is differently, but going through the same kind of parameters, that you need the art in order to express those situations, or in order maybe to, I don't want to say communicate, because that will, you know, I'm not talking about communication, but to embody it, to make it concrete for people, to make it intelligible as well. Yeah.
It's true. And I don't think that we have to privilege or prioritize or hierarchize, but we can say that for whatever else, it can come and do something different. And I'll give you an example. Marcia and I were in Venice for the Biennale, 2016 or 17 or whatever it was, in which there was a lot of effort placed up, or a lot of emphasis placed that year on border crossing. And I went through this thought process, and I think the thought process itself is rather interesting. I walked into a pavilion, I think it was for a Swedish artist. And inside of the pavilion, there was a very placid pond. There were some lights coming down from the ceiling. It was a beautiful space. And on top of this placid pond were rubber duckies. But more or less, that was it. And my thought process was, you're an artist. You're in the Venice Biennale. You've got the eyes of the world in one of the most privileged circumstances in the world. And this is what you've chosen to do, this? And I'm standing there. And because of those thoughts, I kept staring at it and saying to myself, wow, God, what a lost opportunity. What? And all of a sudden, as I'm staring in the water, I realized that there are dead bodies under the water. That if you stared at the water for long enough, those lights coming down from the ceiling were not lights. They were projections of bodies. I was staring at a ship that had gone down in the Mediterranean with refugees on the bottom. But had I not stood there for a long time and thought the thoughts that I was thinking, this would not have happened to me. And then it hit me. And then, you know, your eyes get accustomed to breaking through the surface, and you start seeing bodies all over the place. And I think, wow, this is an experience. It's so different from that which I could put into language. And I wasn't even warned. Like, they never said, look at the water, nothing. That was something really special. And that's, so what, and I have to say also, you'll love this. I talked about this idea with a very, very important specialist in the realm of human smuggling, who's worked primarily on the border between El Paso and Juarez. And she was very much against this journal.
Yeah.
She said, in this realm, we tell people what to think. We're not here to have some artistic experience. We are here to tell them about human smuggling. I thought, wow, that's so fascinating. It sounds like socialist realism as opposed to modern art. So that distinction is quite fascinating. But I think that coming to your own revelations on the basis of art, it does something different.
I think it does, yes. Yeah.
Fascinating.
But thank you very much, Robert. I would like to know if there are some questions from the public for the last minutes we have together. No? Nobody wants to try? Emma.
Hi, Emma.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It's been really fascinating to sort of go through all these canonical works with you from just a different lens and incorporating this new perspective. And you mentioned at the end of your book a sort of plea for, I guess, dedicated to the law side. Is there a plea for the humanities side as well?
That's a great question. Yeah, I've been to literature and law talks in which the legal case that was provided was not sufficiently documented from a legal standpoint. And it's very easy and sometimes seductive to take an example from the law and then provide a lovely humanistic lens, but miss actually the meat and potatoes of the legal side. So it's incumbent, I think, upon us as humanities scholars to get to know the law that we're talking about. And I must say that sounds intimidating. And by that, I don't mean to say that we all need to have JDs in order to speak. On the contrary, one of the things I've noticed in doing this over the years is if you talk to a person who's been doing traffic law for 30 years and you find out that they've been going through a divorce and you say, so how come you didn't represent yourself? You're a lawyer. They'll say, I don't know a damn thing about divorce law. Then if you talk to somebody who's in divorce law and you start talking about treaties, international treaties, they'll say, I don't know a single thing about treaties, and so forth and so on. That in fact, the law is a gigantic, gargantuan thing that has many, there's some fundamental work and so forth and so on. But if you become interested in something for, say, a PhD dissertation or a book that concerns a particular realm of law, the reality is if you work hard for a relatively short period of time, you can actually possess the knowledge that is required to really become an authority on it, honestly. And that's fascinating. And if you like this stuff, I find this perverse pleasure in reading the legal text. They're extraordinarily interesting. And I think that humanist scholars have way more to offer because when we get to things like intention and interpretation and so on, we have the vocabulary to do a lot with it. So I guess one of the pleas to the humanities would be take a look. Don't be scared. There's so much out there that's so amazing to look at. But once you're in there, get onto the Heine online, find the scholarly articles that are out there because wow, there's some amazing stuff. Emma, I can't get into some of the examples necessarily, but man, let me give you one tiny little example. I became fascinated with this whole Moses question. Why is Moses questioning God? And God trying to justify himself and saying, I am that I am. And Moses is like, I don't understand what you're saying. Like it's a really incredible. So I went to the legal scholarship on this. And the legal scholarship takes the same question that I saw in the theological literature and the humanistic literature and looks at it from a more legalistic realm. And I found this fabulous article that says that had God really wanted to achieve his purposes, he would have asked an angel to lead the suffering Israelites out of persecution. The fact that he chose Moses with his speech impediment and his doubt said something about not just the ambition, which he could easily have accomplished. He's God. He's God. But something more, something beyond. And he studied that something more from a legal paradigm. Wow, I've learned things that I couldn't find in the humanities. So I guess the other plea would be to say, this is a really cool realm. There's a lot of stuff in there, and it's, I mean, I think it's really, really enjoyable to do.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. There's a last question we can take. And I think after that, we need to wrap up because maybe Robert will need to rest a bit.
And drink. I mean,
Drink,
talk.
yeah. Don't, you're recorded. But,
I drink recorded and not recorded. So
okay, so no question.
I guess maybe one more answer to Emma, since
Yeah, because that was a great question.
Yeah.
The plea to the humanities. I
Yeah.
like that very much.
so I think that one of the things that us humanists share is a kind of utopian side, a utopian urge, an urge to look at questions that maybe are unresolvable, but that in their symbolic power and in their resonance, open up vistas of understanding that exceed the pragmatic and the technological and the legalistic. And one example, I think, of course, is something I raised, which I love raising, particularly in settings where I know every single person disagrees with me, which is open borders. Open borders can become a very pragmatic way. Well, okay, you open up the borders tomorrow, and how are we going to have enough chocolate bars for everybody, or whatever, enough electricity? There's something about the humanities that allows us to go beyond, go further, go higher, go deeper, all at once. I teach this course with Marcia every year in Switzerland. And we begin in Switzerland, we begin in Geneva, we do border crossing and so forth and so on, from a United Nations standpoint, primarily, NGOs in the United Nations. So they get to know what OCHA does, what UNHCR does, what IOM does, so forth and so on. And after a week of this, you begin to think, wow, there's a crushing ceiling on top of me that's keeping possibilities down because of funding issues, because of resources, because of compromises that have to be made. So following that, this is a classic literature and law course, we then go up into the Alps and we follow Lord Byron and Mary Shelley and Percy and so forth up into the Alps, where in some ways we ask the same questions, because from some standpoint, this is another talk, Frankenstein really is a story of refugees at many, many different levels, including the author and including her lover, Percy, and including Lord Byron. And so we take those questions that had been very confining and confined in Geneva, we go up into the literary realm, which happens to be in the Alps, and it's like the ceiling lifts and possibilities open, and our mind goes in different kinds of places. And that's something, again, Emma, I think is very special about the humanities, that we can allow ourselves such thoughts. It's maybe through those thoughts that the world can truly become more hospitable, to use your term, to the other who is so often scapegoated and who suffers on that ground.
I completely agree. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The first talk in presence of the center, so I hope next time you will be more in the room, because I know that some of you are at Duke, but that will be good to have some maybe more physical interaction with all the health precautions we can put, but still, that would be nice. So that's a message for my audience next time, because I know that some of you are going to be here on Friday, not Friday, on next week. Friday is online, but next week. We have Mabula Sumaoro, and I really hope people can be there in the room with her. Have a nice evening, and thanks again, Robert, for this illuminating talk. That's been very different from the other talk I've hosted. So I really thoroughly enjoy it. And thank you, Kelsey, who have stayed very late for us to help us with the technology. That's very generous. So bye, everyone, and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.